Hey there, and welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. So you've all heard the news that the Hamas hostage deal, or the Hamas reply to the hostage outline that was delineated in Paris, to be more precise, was one that Israel has rejected. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but in a somewhat different context. The less obvious element of this rejection is that it comes in the middle of what I would call a two-stage body blow to American ambitions in the region. So I'm going to tie together two things that have happened in the last 2 days, one of which has gotten more press than the other, but both of which are very important, which is the rejection of the deal by Hamas or rejection by Israel, or just generally lack of progress on the deal. Let's put it that way. And the fact that Saudi Arabia has come out and said that the only way that it could normalize relations with Israel is if a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders was recognized, including that East Jerusalem was its capital. Both of those things were reactions that the United States was not hoping for, and that put a serious blow into what Thomas Friedman called the Biden Doctrine a few days ago in a New York Times editorial. So let's start with Hamas here. So in order to get this Biden Doctrine going, one of the main elements the United States were looking for was a swift ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Now, it knew that Israel wasn't going to agree to that, so it was hoping that there'd be some kind of process that would lock Israel into progressively greater ceasefires with Hamas that would ultimately take the steam out of the conflict. But Hamas gave an answer that Israel is going to have a lot of difficulty with. They said that they want a three-step ceasefire of 45 days for each step. And those steps would be the most vulnerable hostages, then soldiers, and then dead bodies. That's sort of thing that Israel is willing to agree to. But then there's a lot of other things that Israel is not willing to agree to. 1,500 hostages, prisoners, Hamas is asking for Israel to release, including the worst terrorists that Israel does not want to release under any condition, and including Israeli Arabs, which is a precedent that Israel doesn't want to set. Hamas is asking for a cessation of all IDF activity, including in the air, and an end to the war and the withdrawal of Israel from all populated areas in Gaza, which of course leaves very few areas in Gaza that are populated, and the main thrust of Israeli control and battles right now are in all the various refugee camps and in Gaza and Khan Yunis. Also, an increase of water and electricity to Gaza, humanitarian aid to go up to 500, the return of all people in Gaza to their homes, the return of UNRWA to the Gaza Strip in full operation, something that they know is particularly problematic for Israel. And just to add in one last flashpoint that Israel can agree to, a return of the Temple Mount to its situation pre 2002. By the way, no one knows exactly what they mean by that, but they want some change in the Temple Mount status quo, which of course would make them heroes among the Palestinians, and that's why they're doing that. Netanyahu responded correctly, quote, giving in to Hamas's bizarre demands that we heard right now not only won't bring the release of hostages, it will just invite another massacre. So Israel completely rejected it. By the way, the cabinet hasn't met to talk about it. But I do know from various leaks and from what I've been hearing that every single member of the cabinet is against this deal. Some think that Netanyahu was too sharp in rejecting it and think that Israel should just put forth their own counteroffer. But everyone thinks that it's a terrible deal that Hamas want. There was a really touching and unpleasant press conference from the hostages who were released from Gaza after Netanyahu gave his answer. All the hostages there talked about the importance of making a deal now, regardless of Hamas's demands. It was particularly memorable when 16-year-old Sarah Calderon said, quote, Crew, I'm alive and breathing, but in my soul I was murdered in Gaza, and everyone there is murdered repeatedly every day. Others said that Israel is going to lose its morality, and anyone who votes against this deal will have a mark of shame against them for all eternity. But of course, there's an underlying problem here, which is that Hamas wants Israel to stop the war, and Israel feels that if it stops the war with Hamas still in power, it will lose correctly. There's really no basis for a deal here, despite all the tragedy involved for the hostages. But there's a lot else going on that's also torpedoing the so-called Biden doctrine. So that ceasefire isn't coming through, but one of the major elements that the United States has been trying to seduce Israel with is normalization with Saudi Arabia. But that doesn't seem to be happening either. Saudi Arabia put out the clearest statement they have so far on this issue a couple of days ago. And it read, quote, the kingdom has communicated its firm position to the U.S. administration that there will be no diplomatic relations with Israel unless an independent Palestinian state is recognized on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. End quote. Now, right now, Blinken is in the area. Today gave a speech in Israel, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a press conference. But after that, he's going to see Abu Mazen. Abu Mazen was clearly bolstered by what the Saudi Arabians said. He was very happy about that, and he's also going to insist on that. He's apparently going to tell Blinken, according to leaks, that there's no point in the United States recognizing a Palestinian state if it's not going to recognize that Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders and East Jerusalem as the capital. As we know, there is absolutely no chance in hell the Netanyahu government will ever agree to that. I don't think any Israeli government could agree to that. There just is no support for giving up East Jerusalem. There wasn't before the October 7th, and there's even less now. That makes it a non-starter. That's something that either the Saudi Arabians will have to waive and the Palestinians will have to waive. There would have to be more of a vague agreement on a Palestinian state eventually on borders that will be agreed on, or this will not happen. In the meantime, Abu Mazen is also going to meet with Ismail Haniyeh, or at least with Hamas officials in Qatar. So Abu Mazen is going to Qatar to do that. That is an unprecedented step that Abu Mazen is taking that shows that talks between Hamas and the PA on some kind of cooperation on a post-war government are maturing. So we're seeing Abu Mazen start to take the initiative here, linking himself with Hamas, making demands the U.S. can't meet. Saudi Arabia seems to be backing this to some extent. This almost feels like a death blow to the American move to link a two-state solution with normalization to entice Israel into making steps towards that at the end of the war. In Blinken's press conference, he basically acted like none of this was happening and tried to show optimism. So he was asked about the hostages deal. He said, quote, there's a lot of work to be done, and we are very much focused on doing that work and hopefully being able to resume the release of hostages that was interrupted so many months ago. On Saudi Arabia, he said, quote, Mohammed bin Salman repeated his desire and determination to pursue normalization. He also said that if there's a Palestinian state, he is, quote, prepared to do things with and for Israel they were never prepared to do in the past, including steps that would further address any security concerns it might have, end quote. Completely not mentioning the fact that the current terms Saudi Arabia is demanding are untenable from an Israeli perspective. Look, the truth is the U.S. policy right now is in shambles. No one's agreeing to their vague two-state horizon. Israel's not agreeing to it. Saudi Arabia's not agreeing to it. The Palestinians aren't agreeing to it. No one wants it. The Arabs want clear borders for this state before they can talk about it. Israel can't even accept any vague commitment to it. It could be that if Israel had accepted a vague commitment to it a few weeks ago, things would be different. I'm not sure it would be, but now there is a serious problem. The U.S. knows all this, but they don't have a better plan. They would have to come up with a new one. They're not ready to admit defeat yet. I would say, um, I would say that this plan is already failing, might have already failed. What does this mean for Israel? Well, as I've always said here, Israel can't afford to have a vacuum in Gaza. Nature abhors a vacuum. When there's a vacuum, who goes in there? Whoever has the most guns, the most influence, that is Hamas. And that's what's happening right now. Every time Israel evacuates an area, Hamas go in. But with this American-led deal not coming to fruition, partially it's Israel's fault, but it looks to me like even if Israel had said yes, this wouldn't be happening. Israel has to take action. What action can it take? Well, it needs to declare that while all this is happening and there are so many disagreements on the political future status of the Gaza Strip, it's going to form its own administration. It's going to form a civil administration in Gaza. Israel will form a civil administration in Gaza. That administration would be similar in its scope to what Israel had in Gaza from 1967 until the 1990s when it ruled it directly. Who would man it? Would it be Palestinians? Would any Palestinians agree to participate? Could they get international participation? That's the kind of thing that Israel needs to work out. But Israel needs to set it up on its own, looking for partners willing to work with it on its own vision, on a temporary scale, on a temporary time frame, because Israel doesn't want to stay there forever. But right now, it can't have a vacuum and it can't wait for diplomatic solution. If Israel wants to rule Gaza in the interim, Israel has to take the steps necessary to rule Gaza. As I said before, Golani and Givati troops aren't going to clear out the garbage and collect taxes. A civilian administration needs to be set up in the Gaza Strip ASAP in areas that Israel has cleared. So people keep asking me, it's not the day after yet. The war hasn't ended. Why should we be setting up an administration? This administration needs to be set up in areas that Israel has cleared out from terrorism already, not in areas that it hasn't. So, for example, Gaza City, yes. Han Yunis, not yet. Right, Rafah, Israel isn't even in there yet. So when there are areas that are considered clear, relatively secure, that's when the administration would move in. The administration would be protected by the IDF, but it would be doing things that the IDF can't do. And that way, they would be creating pressure on Hamas to reach a deal by taking over all of Gaza, putting in civilian administration where they are not. That might also put pressure on the US, on Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinian administration to move towards a position that Israel can accept. It's also a chance for Israel to get rid of UNRWA once and for all. If Israel's in there, they don't have to let that organization back in. They can wait until the international community removes them and replaces them with something else. Israel can, in the meantime, distribute aid so it doesn't go to Hamas. All this works together to further Israeli war aims. It's dangerous, but it's bold, and it's much better than doing nothing. Israel can't just sit around in Gaza waiting for other actors to get their act together. It needs to create that civil administration now. Not to stay in Gaza for good, but in order to have leverage over what will happen in Gaza eventually. Okay, I have a bunch of questions, only from two people, but one of these people asked me a lot of questions. So I'll try to answer them all. So I'll start with the question from Agent Smith. It's a little bit outdated. The longer Hamas delays responding to the ceasefire proposal, Israel should toughen up on its terms, Shark Tanks style. Do you agree? Because quite frankly, I think the proposed terms are lousy. The longer this war goes on, a hostage deal is reaching diminishing returns. And I think what that means is that more and more of them are dead. They may as well finish the job and find the hostages themselves, or it may even be ready for an end of war exchange. Therefore, they cannot go to the prior rumored terms. So the question is, should Israel toughen up its position? I think yes. I think not so much in its negotiation terms, because that doesn't seem very firm, because negotiation terms can be changed, but that too. But more on the ground, what I'm suggesting, escalating the war to Rafah, putting in a civilian administration, showing that the longer Hamas delay, the more ground they lose. Harry Newhoff asked several questions. One, why haven't there been successful Entebbe-esque operations to free our hostages? So, yeah, that's a very good question. And the reason is the hostages are being held in such a way that if the IDF goes in, the Hamas will know about it in advance through, booby traps, cameras, etc., and they'll execute the hostages. And that has happened at least twice that I know of. Um, the hostages are being moved around all the time to make it difficult for intel, and they're being used as human shields to protect the top Hamas command. So basically, the reason Israel hasn't been able to pull in Entebbe in so long is because after Entebbe, they can see us coming. In Entebbe, they couldn't see us coming. No one imagined that Sayeret Matkal would show up in the middle of Africa and rescue people, so they weren't under that much security. Gaza is a whole different story. Can you speak about the claims about Bibi supporting Hamas? I've heard claims about suitcases of money and random but nothing concrete. Okay, so suitcases full of money is the kind of thing that people say when they want to besmirch political rival. Like, Biden sent suitcases of money to Iran. Netanyahu sent suitcases of money to Hamas. That's not really how things work. But Netanyahu had a policy, a declared policy, by the way, of letting Hamas stay in power in the Gaza Strip in order to kind of divide and conquer the Palestinian nationalist movement. So that way Israel wouldn't have to negotiate with the PA over a Palestinian state. In order to keep Hamas in power and to keep Gaza placated, the policy, which was approved too by the IDF, was to send money to Gaza through Qatar to maintain the needs of the population. The Israeli assumption was that if the needs of the population in Gaza are taken care of, they'll be less dangerous. All that turned out not to be true, but that's what was happening. Qatar was sending millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to Hamas, and Israel was allowing it because it thought that it was good for its interests. It was wrong. And yes, Bibi supported Hamas to an extent because that was his security doctrine. It was a terrible security doctrine. I've heard from a chess master that you can't think 15 moves ahead while playing. You could only think of the next few activities. Why does Israel have to think about the end goal day after? I think I kind of addressed that. The end goal day after is already here now. Israel's already taken over entire cities. Once you take over cities, you have to figure out how to rule them. In World War II, when the Russians and the United States were taking over cities from the Nazis, they had to immediately figure out what kind of rule would be there. First, the soldiers would rule, then they would transfer it to local officials, that kind of thing. They did all that immediately. So, this whole thing with the day after is a bit of a canard. When you take over a new area, you have to figure out what to do with it. Israel's already taken over most of the Gaza Strip, so it needs to figure out what to do with it. The day after maybe implies some things Israel doesn't need to think about, like is there going to be a Palestinian state, not going to be a Palestinian state? That's pretty far off. But administration in the cities needs to be now because Hamas is moving back in now. Another question. What is your opinion on Avigdor Lieberman being an idiot by not joining the coalition and forcing Likud to join with Gabir and Smolt? There's an insult here told Smortrich, I guess. Our friend Harry doesn't like it. I don't either. So you're assuming that Lieberman is being an idiot, and I don't think Lieberman's being an idiot. So Lieberman's building a very strong case for himself. Lieberman is on record as being the only person of power in Israel in recent history to say that we should not allow Hamas to base itself in Gaza. They should be removed ASAP. That the policy of divide and conquer between the PA and Hamas was a mistake. And as defense minister, he kept trying to convince Netanyahu to take out Hamas. Now he sounds like a prophet, right? So what he's betting is that if he's not part of this government will probably drop the ball on the war, or at least a lot of people will think that they dropped the ball on the war. And then if he's not part of the government and he was against the policy to begin with, he can come out as the only major Israeli politician that was right about everything. And he's doing quite well in the polls. And my guess is he's going to do better in the polls. So you're worrying about the country. It could be that for the country, it would have been better for Lieberman to join. Although you could argue, why does it matter? It's not like Lieberman determines, anything on the grand security scale. But as far as electoral votes are concerned, Lieberman's doing the right thing, even if it doesn't work out, and I think it will, by the way. He's making a smart gamble. So I don't think he's being an idiot at all. He's a very smart man. Another question, this time to me. You seem comfortable with a Palestinian state. Do rockets in Tel Aviv not worry you? You don't think we would have an evacuation of central Israel as a result of that? You don't believe it will be like the north with Hezbollah? They're causing the evacuation of 80,000? Yeah, I mean, comfortable with a Palestinian state isn't the right word. I'm very uncomfortable with this conflict continuing forever. So what I would like to see from a Palestinian state is one that's demilitarized, one where Israel has security access, one where there's guarantees for Israeli security, one where Israel can go in to take care of terrorists if need be. But in the long term, one that will undermine the core, the basis of the enmity between Israelis and Palestinians, so that eventually, who knows when, Palestinians won't feel the need to shoot missiles at Israel. So that's what I would like to see from a Palestinian state. I just don't want this conflict to continue forever. And I think that Israel right now has the leverage to make changes in Palestinian society, demand things that might put that in motion. But I'm not optimistic. I don't think Palestinian state would solve all the problems, but I don't see that not having a Palestinian state is working out so well either. Finally, what is the situation with checkpoints? Is it just around the West Bank? Is it outside every town in the West Bank? What's the deal with that? Yeah, so there's less checkpoints now than there used to be, actually. But checkpoints are there so that to prevent the entry of terrorists from the West Bank into Israel and to prevent terrorism against settlers in the West Bank. If there weren't settlers in the West Bank, there'd be less checkpoints because you could allow more activity inside the West Bank to be unhindered, and then they would be on the perimeter. But because the settler population is intermingled, checkpoints are necessary in all sorts of places inside the West Bank. Traditionally, Israel discovered that when it removes unnecessary checkpoints, the amount of tension and terrorism in the West Bank goes down. Recently, none of that's been true. There's been a level of hostility and violence in the West Bank that has basically been a third intifada. So all this becomes less relevant. But the checkpoints are necessary for security purposes. But that's another reason I'd like to see Israel out of there, so that those kind of um, causes of friction between Israelis and Palestinians that aren't strictly necessary can go away and create more harmony between the societies. I think that these settlers are causing a lot of friction there. But that's my opinion. Like I said, I don't think that any of this would be a magic bullet. I just think that over time it would reduce the enmity and hostility between the communities. Okay, so that is Israel Explained for today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon, on Shael Media. That's Shael Media on Patreon. Still working on that 12 Tribes podcast episode. That'll be out in a few days. And I will see you here very soon.